Hey folks, the man with the legendary beard here to give you some advice on crafting legendary cards. Seriously, look at the beard. It's the same color as Hearthstone's legendary gems. Look at it. Look. Stare at its majesty.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Alright, enough nonsense. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 best overall cards from all expansions to craft based on the meta right now. They'll still build a nice foundation for your collection. But of course, a lot of you are just curious about Descent of Dragons cards themselves and which ones you might be able to commit to as well. So since a lot of these won't make the overall top 10 because they're competing against classic cards, still wanted to include some ideas here for safe crafts and cards that are probably safe. These are based on current win rates, deck inclusions, things like flexibility. For instance, Frizz Kindleroos might seem pretty good. She's in a bunch of decks right now, but ultimately she could fall off pretty hard if dragons fall off. So a little bit of risk there bundled into that one, but this will give you an idea for Descent of Dragons. Anything not featured here might still be good, might still be part of a key deck. I'm not saying anything outside of this is bad, just that it's not super safe to add to your collection for a longer term basis. So let's go ahead and start off with the top 10 here at the number 10 spot, and you'll see something a little different here. I'm including some power ratings for these cards across three things. Up first is the power level of the card itself, its strength, how much it will help you just like win games or define a deck. You've got longevity there in the second spot for how long it's got left in standard format. So classic cards are going to be really high. Snip Snap here rotating out fairly soon in April, so very low longevity score. And then also flexibility, how many different classes or archetypes can use this card. Snip Snap played across a ton of stuff, so very high score there. So with Snip Snap, you're looking at a great card. Hopefully you got it for free, you never had to craft it. But the power level, of course, really high. It's great on 3, great on 6, great on 9, great with Magnetic. Very strong card, very, very flexible. One of the most widely played cards in Hearthstone. It's just leaving standard format soon, so it's kind of hard to bite the bullet and commit to this one when you know you've only got maybe 3 or 4 months left with it before it leaves. That's not ideal, so a great card to have, just not a great card to have for very long. And in fact, the same can be said for our buddy Ziliax here, another card that's just off the charts when it comes to flexibility. Every deck runs this, one of the most played cards ever. It's also very, very powerful, much like Snip Snap. Often feels game-winning when you play it. Sometimes those big heals, those big magnetic plays, that perfect mid-game stabilization. But again, it's just leaving standard format soon. So these are the only cards on this list that are leaving in the rotation in April. They're just good enough to still be worth a recommendation, even though they're leaving soon. So up next here, I got my buddy Greenskin, who is, of course, in Classic Set. So as far as we know, he's going to stick around forever, giving him that 10 out of 10 longevity, but the power level a little lower on this guy. He feels pretty good often, but flexibility really low for Greenskin because he has to go in a deck with weapons. That writes off many classes right away, and beyond that, he's usually exclusive to really aggressive styles of play as well. So fairly limited in flexibility, but still a great tool to have because so many aggressive weapon decks have utilized this. Pirate stuff like Pirate Warrior today using this card to great success. So a guy that's going to keep paying off for you long term, just not quite as strong as some of the future options on this list. Like, for instance, Siamat, a card used pretty much in Highlander lists exclusively. He's just good enough to be like great in Highlander decks, but maybe not good enough to make it in most other decks. Most of them have a more defined plan than Siamat is willing to offer. But still going to be around for at least over a year. He's not rotating out until the 2021 April rotation, so you got a long time to use Siamat here. Pretty flexible still. He's not necessarily limited to just control mid-range decks. Aggro decks can even use this in some cases. Those faster Highlander decks are happy to squeeze in Siamat from time to time. And a card that still feels very good to play. Like, the big-time swing removal card. Drop that 6/6, remove something giant from the board. Sometimes just that Divine Shield Wind Fury is enough to set up a game-winning play. So Siamat is really, really strong as we all expected. Not quite those, Ziliax levels of power that some people anticipated, but nonetheless a great card to have. And then with the exact same scores here, we've got our buddy Kronk's Dragonhoof, the Galakrond support card. And because Galakrond right now is just everywhere in the meta, like all the top decks right now are Galakrond decks, of course it's going to make sense to have Kronk's because he's really, really good in those Galakrond worlds, helping you find your Galakrond swing turns or just unleashing those crazy devastations that can often be game swinging themselves. A pretty flexible card beyond that. It is, although limited to Galakrond decks, there's enough classes that can play Galakrond and enough variations on Galakrond, both fast decks, slow decks, that he still has a ton of flexibility. So another one that, because you got so many free Galakronds, it makes a lot of sense to add Kronks into your collection and fully support those Galakron decks that you're probably playing for right now. So next up here, let's take a look at Malygos, another big staple classic legendary. These are where they really start to get kind of like, you gotta have these in your collection, and that's because the power level for Malygos, of course, absurd, just game-winning combo setups so very often. Clearly it's gonna be around forever as part of the classic set. Good score there. It's really the flexibility that limits Malygos, because he is almost exclusively restricted to those late game burst combo decks, which can be awkward to build towards. They can be really finicky in the meta. It's not like there's always one of them showing up, but they show up like, every couple expansions or every other meta, that sort of thing. So still a very good card to have, and one of those tools you just need to have in your tool belt in Hearthstone. Next up here, let's take a look at Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, exciting new Highlander support card in Descent of Dragons. Obscene power level. This one feels so strong when you play it. Often either just overwhelming a board in a way that most opponents can't react to, or just setting up shenanigans, getting those crazy Dragon Queen Alexstrasza chains or big Imrus plays, whatever it is. Dragon Queen can absolutely win games outright. She's, of course, going to be around for a while since she just hit, and still a fair bit of flexibility with Dragon Queen Alexstrasza. Although she is limited to Highlander specifically, there are a bunch of different classes still able to use Alexstrasza successfully. Now, she's not really good in aggro decks. Like, some can kind of maybe put her there, but a lot don't make sense for Dragon Queen. She's just a little bit too late game in those really fast Highlander styles. There's a few decks that exclude her. I would otherwise bump her flexibility up a little bit higher, but between the Highlander restriction and a little bit of an archetype limitation, I think 7's a good spot for Dragon Queen Alexstrasza here, but nonetheless, a very powerful card. Staple centerpiece right now in the meta. You really need to have this one. And then we have her twin, I guess here, her former self, normal Alexstrasza, which really gets the bump here because this is always going to be a part of your collection. Alexstrasza, perhaps not quite as powerful, still a great card, obviously, very high power level, sets up all kinds of burst combos, just feels good to drop sometimes for those big late game heals and stabilizations. Lots of control decks have run this throughout history, and lots of combo decks have run this throughout history to put those health totals at susceptible levels, and that makes her a great card, just not the most flexible of cards. There's a limitation on the number of decks that can run her, and we often go a meta or two where Alexstrasza is kind of on the fringe, maybe a tier 3 inclusion, but not like a big centerpiece of a tier 1 deck. So some limitations, but nonetheless a card you really need to have, one of those, again, key legendaries. Now let's take a look at Zephyrus the Great, our other Highlander card, and I think this one takes the edge over Dragon Queen Alexstrasza because, first off, his power level is just through the roof. Maybe the single most powerful card in the entire history of Hearthstone. So many amazing plays because he's everything, right? He's game-winning burst damage. He's big-time removal, those twisting nethers. He's early tempo. It's just literally whatever you need, Zephyrus answers, and that's why probably the single most powerful card ever. Maybe an 11 out of 10 if that's possible on this scale. Still going to be around for a while. I suspect Highlander decks will have a lot of power as long as Zephyrus is in the meta, and even more flexibility than something like Dragon Queen Alexstrasza because control decks love him, and hyper-aggressive Highlander decks love him, and even decks that aren't Highlander, things like OTK Paladin and some versions of Questrood still run Zephyrus, so a lot of flexibility. Now, I didn't go say like 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 because he still is fairly limited to Highlander. There's a lot of decks that just can't run Zephyrus at all, so clearly not a perfect 10 on something like Ziliax, but nonetheless a very flexible card, and that's why he's the second highest on this entire list. But the honor for the highest goes to our good friend Leroy Jenkins. He has taken this spot so many times in past iterations of this video, and that will not change here. Insanely good power level as the most consistent finisher in all of Hearthstone's history, still being played in tons of aggro decks. And of course, classic card, he's going to be around forever, and I expect him to be played for as long as he's around. And also a surprising amount of flexibility here for Leroy, although, You might say, well, wait a minute, Regis, he's really an aggro card only. That's not necessarily true, because he's also been a combo card and popped up in some control decks in the past as a big finisher. Things like, say, old Handlock would run this with some power overwhelmings and faceless manipulators, that sort of stuff back in the day with Emperor Thorison. So he has had a surprising amount of flexibility, plus just every class can make this thing work. There's no, say, Highlander restriction for Leroy. You toss him in anyway. So pretty much almost perfect here. If he was just a little better in the average control deck, he'd pretty much have a perfect score as the ultimate card, but he gets close enough anyway to be the single best legendary card that you can have in your Hearthstone collection. And there you go, folks. The legendary beard itself has spoken. Those are the best legendary cards for you, both from Descent of Dragons, but also overall. So if you're looking to build a good Hearthstone set, I think these will serve you very, very well. Now, let me know what you think about these crazy scores I added in. Thought it'd just be fun to give you something extra to look at, kind of break down my thought process on some of these. Cards like Ziliax are great, amazing, but when you're building a long-term Hearthstone collection, you only got a few months. Yeah, they lose a little bit of priority, right? I thought I'd capture that sort of thing in the numbers. Plus, it helps you decide, do I want to prioritize longevity, raw power? Because you maybe don't know what you need, but you think, I want to really focus on hitting Legend this month as opposed to building this really super long-term collection. Gotta craft Ziliax in that case, right? So anyway, let me know how that read on video, what you think of it, and how you disagree with all those numbers. Or maybe some cards you think should be on this list with your own numerical assessments. I love it. Lots of stuff to talk about in the comments. But until then, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, of course, subscribe and like it and do all that stuff. I don't really know. I'm a boomer. But I thank you much for watching. I love you. And until next time, game on.
Dragons take flight above the ice and snow.